Okay, welcome everybody. Seems we're connected both on Zoom and YouTube. Fantastic. Welcome. If this is your first time, welcome to the Fermentology mini seminar series. I'm Michelle Jewell. I'm from NC State's Department of Applied Ecology, based here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this is our weekly-ish mini seminar series that's based on the culture, science, and the history of cultured foods. And today is all about spices and Mesopotamian food, kind of, and I'll let the researchers explain that. We're joined by Patricia, Gojko, and Pia from Harvard University, and they're going to take us on a journey back in time to some of the oldest recipes literally carved in stone. We'll have a live Q&A, so please put your questions either in the Zoom or the YouTube chats, and I'll ask as many as I can at the end of the talk. So without further ado, take it away, Spice Team.
Gojko, I think you're muted. Gojko, you're muted.
Now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I am sorry. I'm having some technical trouble here. My mouse is not working. However, my keyboard is. Thank you all and welcome to our talk. And of course, it had to start out with a little technical glitch. That just goes with the territory these days, it seems. We're going to be talking to you indeed about food in ancient Babylonia. And Pia, are you starting us off with this slide on why food?
Yeah, I am, because I think the question is why food? And I don't know if we have to convince this particular audience why we care about food, but I still think it's helpful to just take a step back and think about why this matters, sort of big picture, small picture. So if we think about food in general, it really kind of structures society. If you think about everything from how you produce food to how that food is distributed with a transportation system, with a commerce system, how that food is then sort of cooked and enjoyed, it really sort of structures all of society, the entire food system. It is also deeply connected to who we are. It kind of defines our life. Everything from on an individual level to a communal level, whether it's everyday food, whether it's festive food, special occasion food, religious rite food, whether you're a commoner or a king, you have to eat every day. It kind of affects our hierarchies, how our group behavior. It affects so much of life and of society in general. In sort of big ways and small ways. And this is true today, and it's been true all through history. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we delve into this.
And what we are looking at, our case here today, is ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, Tigris and the Euphrates, this incredibly fertile alluvial plain where legend had it that the Garden of Eden itself was located. It is an exceptionally fertile area, and probably also this is the very reason why this area is where the first cities and states arise. And with those first cities and states, we also get the first writing system in existence, the cuneiform writing system. What makes Mesopotamian history and how we can write about it so different from essentially any other type of ancient history, even up to pre-modern times, is related to this fact, that script came from there and came to be from the beginning to be tied into clay as a medium. The tablets that we're looking at, and here I must correct our host, are not stone tablets, they're clay tablets. And clay in this area is ubiquitous. One could say that the whole area is made up of clay, highly fertile clay that, by the way, aside from being really good for growing your vegetables, is also excellent as a writing material. Why is that important? Because in all other periods and places from ancient history and up until essentially printing, the texts that we have preserved are those that were either carved into stone or etched into metal because they were intended for preservation, or they are texts that have survived through sort of freaks of nature in various ways, or they are texts that were intentionally copied down for posterity, be it in an Egyptian cloister or a European monastery or something along those lines. Whereas from ancient Mesopotamia, because clay is soil, it is effectively indestructible in the ground itself, the writing material survives directly. The sources that we have are those that we have today. There's no copyist, no intermediary needed. And the material being ubiquitous and extremely cheap means that a lot of people had access to the materiality of writing, so to say. And they could write about all sorts of things that we normally never ever hear about in history. And we have these voices that we don't usually get in pre-modern history, the voices of women, the voices of children, the voices of the slaves and the poor. So we can find all these different kinds of textual genres here that we don't otherwise typically have from the ancient world, or at least only in very small numbers. And one of these, of course, is food. And here we have not some of the oldest, but the oldest food recipes, really, as intended instructions for cooking, understood. These are tablets that were written down about 4,000 years ago. We date them to around 1720 BCE now. There are 3 of those. They come from southern Iraq. And for the longest of times, they were not even recognized for what they were. It was due to a French Assyriology, Jean Bottereau, that this was, that they were identified in the first place as culinary texts. And of course, people, as Pia just described, being involved in food, all of us, every day in every aspect almost of our beings, there was a substantial interest in these texts from when they became known in the 1980s. And this is a continued interest, and you'll find these, you may know them from, then there's an article on the BBC, then there's something on the radio about these. So they continue to sort of crop up, and people are fascinated by these facts that they're the oldest recipes. He himself, Bottereau, published 2 books offering translations and interpretations, one in French, which is scholarly, and one in English, which is sort of more for a broader audience, and both are widely available, and you could look at those if you wanted to. And these indeed are also then recipes that fascinate us in the group here that will be introduced in a moment. And we have sort of focused our attention on one particular tablet, the one shown here. You can see that it's sort of broken in one corner, but enough of it is preserved that we can understand that it's a summary collection of about 25 recipes, all of those stews. And this tablet, unlike some of the other 2, gives you brief directions and a statement at the end of the text, which then lists its contents as 21 meat stews and 4 green stews. In itself is interesting. They have this distinction already of sort of meat-based cuisine and vegetarian, if you wish, although not in the modern sense. They use animal fat. Our focus is then on these texts. We'll be talking you through some examples of recipes later on. But one thing we need to lay out now is that these texts are unique. They are very difficult to read, and key terms in them were therefore left untranslated by Bottereau. And this is important because, as you can imagine, in any food recipe, if there's one ingredient that you can't identify, then the whole dish may be totally different once you cook it without that ingredient or putting in the wrong ingredient. Imagine a lasagna, but misreading, let's say, the beef meat and understanding it as, I don't know, cauliflower. You would have a substantially different dish after that in many ways. So this is something that we have tried with our group to understand better. We want to bridge the linguistic, the cultural, the historical gap that is between us and these texts in an approach that Pia will talk about in a moment, and hopefully get slightly better understanding of those recipes than Bartol had.
So how did we start this project? So people from different disciplines and from different expertises, we got together, we went to Nawal's kitchen. She is a food historian, expert in Near Eastern food traditions that was super key in order to understand the cultural and historical context of the recipes. And we also had in our team 2 cuneiform scholars, an expert on cultural heritage, a scientific chef, a chemical biologist specialized in food. So we have like all of this interdisciplinary approach that was key in order to understand how to approach these recipes that, as Gojko said, were like super brief and with a huge historical gap.
So all in all, what we're thinking, the approach that we are taking is both a experimental and scientific approach and a cultural historical approach. And both of them kind of have their merits and their challenges. And our hope is that by doing them together, that we're really looking at the problem from many angles and coming back to interpretations of these recipes that are as close as possible as we can get. So my training is on the sciences. And when I look at these recipes, and you'll see the recipes soon, there are certain questions that stand out. There are certain challenges, and then there are all these opportunities, all these merits that as an experimental scientist, I want to go and do it with my hands and see what happens. And so that's basically what we've done. So what I will talk about now is on the left side of this slide, which is really goes back to my first point here is that cooking is an experimental science. You can look and study recipes all you want, but you don't know how the dish tastes until you cook it. You don't know what happens and how the material behaves until you cook it. It's really experimental. My second point is that ingredients today really have the same chemical and physical properties today as they did thousands of years ago. You know, biological materials are made of networks. They are primarily water. They behave a certain way when you manipulate them in certain ways. And that's the same today as it was thousands of years ago. The same is true for the various techniques that we use when we cook. The way heat transfers through a material, especially in biological material, is the same today as it was thousands of years ago. When we make Maillard reactions happen on our steak, the chemical process is the same today as it was thousands of years ago. Same is true for fermentation, obviously. You know, charring, broiling, really, you know, whisking, any of these things, the process is the same. A fourth point is about the human sensory experience. And this really goes back to our experience as we experience the food. So we can assume that the sensory experience today is probably not so different from how it was thousands of years ago. There are certain outer bounds to how our taste buds and olfactory receptors process this input. Even if there are sort of cultural and personal preferences, different sensitivities, there is sort of somewhere, and maybe more so for some textures and tastes than others, some kind of outer bound for what is kind of acceptable as food. Something that is just too bitter is just not going to be a palatable food. Something that is so hard that we can't really break into it and chew it and ingest it and get energy from it is not going to be a very good food. And so there are kind of these outer bounds, and within those we can play and understand the recipes. The last point here on this list is cultural traditions, and the idea that there are many other examples of cultural traditions that have stayed the same for centuries and for millennia. And it is very likely that this is also true for some cooking traditions. And so by looking at, and Gojko is going to talk more about that, and by looking at how various techniques go back in time through later records, we can maybe understand something about the earliest records. So those are kind of the merits of this approach, and there are some challenges. You'll see this when we show you the recipes, that there's certain ambiguities about the quantities and order of steps in recipes. So none of these recipes have quantities listed. Often the order of steps are not quite clear. So clearly there is some understanding that the person who is doing this has some knowledge, and that is kind of implied. And it's true for these recipes, but it's also true for recipes until relatively recently, where all these, many of the things that you do are kind of implied. You don't bother to write them down because the cook knows. And then the last challenge is the challenge of ingredients. Often, and we'll talk more about this, and this is where Gojko starts to scratch his brain, and he starts to go and look things up in all his books. Often the translation is not entirely clear, but even in cases when we know the translation, it is not clear what part of an ingredient we're using. So let's say you mention cilantro. Well, does this refer to the leaf, or the flower, or the root, or the seed? Right? It could be anything, and it's sort of often unclear what part is being used. So this is kind of my thoughts on the experimental level. And Gojko, you're going to tell us a little bit about the cultural and historical approach.
Which is, of course, where Barjamovic started out. He started out with what you call the Buchspiel and worked from there. What we're trying to do here is to combine the two methods, but that doesn't mean that we should not still very much go to the cultural historical approach. We have tried to widen out the scope of our search and look, for instance, to identify what the set of base ingredients would have been that was demonstrably in use around the time that this stuff was written down. So here you have access to both textual sources and to archaeological sources, especially in the last 3 or 4 decades. There has been sort of an acute attention in archaeology to preservation of seeds, foodstuff, plant materials, the analyses of animal remains, bones, typically teeth, stuff like that. So with all of that, you can sort of produce compendia of what would you have to cook in the first place. The second thing is then to go through lexicography to actually try and see whether the ingredients that are mentioned in these recipes might turn up in other contexts, and they do sometimes in medical recipes, sometimes in recipes for dyes, or in inventories of plants where they occur alongside other plants in maybe meaningful groups, which allows you to second guess sometimes the identity of a given ingredient, or at least place it in a category. Okay, here it turns up with legumes, here it's used as a colorant, here it's used as an antiseptic maybe, and one thing leading to the other, you can sometimes tease out meanings. Then, especially because our team member Nawal, whom Patricia mentioned before, is a local Iraqi and a food historian, has assembled a large knowledge, so to say, of local dialectal words that are still in use in, let's say, the mountainous areas of Iraq and things like that, where you might find dialects that retain what are effectively the same words as our texts have, ancient words, or whatever you want to call them. And finally, what she's an expert in is medieval cooking. Basically, she has worked on 2 very large medieval cooking manuscripts. One of them is from Iraq, from the 11th century AD. And you will find a couple of recipes in there that are astoundingly similar to some of the things that we are dealing with here. And in fact, the tradition for producing stews, broths, and soups as a staple is still very much a part of Iraqi cuisine today. So all of those things can help you, together with sort of going back and forth with the experimental method, to identify things. But of course, the recipes use lots of unknown terms. The terms that might survive might have shifted their meaning over time, and there can be false analogies to later practices. So we have to be very, very careful. And in every case, go back and also see, can we get something from the archaeology? Can we look at the cooking wares and see, what techniques they would have had? What kinds of ovens did they have at disposal? What sort of vessels would they have baked in, etc.
Okay, so how this cuisine look like? So what were the main ingredients? So the main ingredients are listed here in 7 key groups. So the first and one of the most important groups were the cereals, since their staple food was mainly beer and bread. So they basically had barley, and in less amounts some wheat, sesame, millet, but mainly barley. So it was basically fermented into bread and beer, but sometimes also into porridge, and the porridge was also fermented. They had more than 300 types of bread, and also they had even categorized the different types of flour depending on the size. Also, they had a lot of access to sweeteners. They had a lot of meat. Like Gojko said, 21 out of 25 stews were meat-based. The fat that they were used to cook the stews was sheep tail fat, even though they had also like sesame oil and other vegetable fats. They were mainly using sheep tail fat. They also have some dairy. A lot of the stews, you will see that they have milk added, but they also had the sense of fermenting milk and having this yogurt called tisimu that was milk turned into sour. And it was also sometimes added into the stews. And we don't know if it was also as a way of thickening. Mesopotamians like very complex flavors, and you can see in all the recipes a lot of herbs like cilantro, coriander, arugula, mustard seeds, and in almost all of them they also had leek, onion, and garlic listed together. So they also like a lot of aliaceus and fruits, nuts, aromatics. As you can see, it was a very complex and sophisticated cuisine for being dated 4,000 years ago.
We can say something about the culinary taste. And there are 3 points that we would like to point out, that since this is about spices also and about fermentology also and so on. Well, some of those points are touched about here. What is special about Babylonian food, and how is it different from what you might find in, let's say, if you went to an Iraqi restaurant today? Well, first of all, there seem to be these standard condiments that are around on any table when they eat, and that are mentioned again and again in texts. Which you would presumably combine with your, for instance, your stews according to taste, and those would be vinegar and fish brine. And the fish brine is fermented, like the later Greek garos or Roman garum that you may already know, Arabic muri. Of course, the culinary descendants are still in use around the Mediterranean today, and you will know it from Southeast Asian food and so on. They seem to have formed a culinary pair for taste and balance, and often, as I said, they occur in the texts as a pair. That's interesting. So you should imagine that. Probably umami and sour. Huh? Then there is another profound difference between their cuisine and ours, plus those that are around in the area today, and that is that they don't have food that packs heat in the same way, and apparently we have a love for that or a need for that. Some cultures have more than others, right? If you go to South Asia, you will have very hot food. Not so much maybe in Iraq, but nevertheless, something like pepper is pretty ubiquitous. These people did not have access to pepper. Pepper is a plant that comes from South Asia later on into the region. So instead, they're trying to get that effect clearly using other means. For instance, spicy greens that you can use as garnitures. You might pound up the green part of a leek in order to get a peppery taste. You might combine things like arugula, spring leek, shallots, and garlic to get that peppery taste, fresh ones, right? And finally, there's a huge variety of kitchen herbs and spices, as Patricia just said. Most of those remain unknown. So here you get a sense of sort of the challenges that we're facing. We have their names there in parentheses, but we don't know what they are. But with about half a dozen we do know, and as you can see, some of them even have the same name to this day. Like ninu is nane in Arabic and Turkish and so on. Saffron, asapuranu, is the same word also in English. Kamunu, cumin, is also a survivor that has gone into the English language, and sesame, by the way, which is not a spice, is another one. It's called shamashamu in Akkadian. So that gives you a sense of the sort of the spice palette that we're dealing with.
Okay, so time for a recipe. This is one of 4 recipes we're going to show you, and we're starting with this one because it is in some ways a more simple recipe. It is one of the few recipes that is fully vegetarian. But let me start by kind of orienting you in this textual part up here. So the top part here is basically the 2D rendering of the cuneiform. So this is how it would be written out. The leftmost part here is the transliteration. So that's just the interpretation of the sign kind of written out. And then the right part is the transcription. So that's how you would actually sort of write out the words. And then the lower part here is the English translation. And for your convenience, and so you can orient yourself, the title of the dish, pasrutum, is in green, and that's true for all of these recipes. So you can see the green in the top right, top left of each of these recipes. In red are the ingredients, so meat, kurat, cilantro, salt, and blue is basically the technique. That's what you do, it's the verb. So a few words about this recipe. So it's one of the few vegetarian recipes. It's relatively simple. It's kind of milder in flavor. You really just sort of saute the vegetables in some fat. You add the water, the liquid. You add the leek and the garlic, as Gojko just mentioned, to give it a little bit of sort of heat. And then at the end, you put on some dried sourdough. And you may notice, actually, never mind. Put on some dried sourdough, and it's unclear what the title actually refers to, but we think the sourdough may be a hint to that. So pasrutum comes, Gojko is really the specialist in this, but it means to untie or to unwind. So we're hypothesizing that it could be a sort of comfort dish. It's a sort of a milder dish, or that it could have something to do with what happens when you add the dry sourdough to the liquid, and it kind of unfurls itself and spreads into the stew. So this is the first recipe, and I'm not going to say much more about this because I think there are 3 more, and Gojko and Patricia will tell you about the other ones.
Okay, this second recipe, we chose it actually because it has 2 ingredients that were very common in these recipes. One is, I already mentioned, it has meat, it has a lamb, then it has milk in the recipe, and this is part of the liquid that it has. It also, I would like to highlight, that has salt. That salt is mentioned in a lot of the recipes, so they already had this sense of flavor super developed. And I would like to point out what Pia just said about these dried barley cakes, because this is called bapiru bread, and you may have heard, because a lot of beer experts call it like the ancient beer bread, because it was thought that it was dried malted barley that was carried out by the people, and then when they wanted to make beer, they were fermenting this bapiru bread, but it was also added into the stews. And we think that one of the main reasons, like they do also nowadays, and Nahuel told us, is in order to soak part of the liquid and to thicken the broth. So we think that they already had a sense of texture as well as flavor. And it was a very rich and strong stew.
The third recipe we chose for its exoticism. So by now, as you heard from Pia, green gives you the title of the dish. That's interesting in itself, right? That they have, the concept is that a dish is called something. It's called lasagna or pizza or whatever, or in this case, muela mutum, Elamite broth. The other thing about this one is that this is a foreign dish. So it's called, Elam is a part of the world which today belongs within the territory of the state of Iran, the westernmost part of Iran, and it is a very culturally separate and different area than southern Iraq, but sort of sees the rise of large cities and states around the same time, about 3,500 BC or so, give or take. Here is another side of cuisine, this notion that other people have other dishes, and you can import those. And they even tell us at the very, as sort of after the recipe is done, they tell us zukanda shumshu. The original name of this dish is zukanda. So there's a kind of a bit of food ethnography here, 1720 BC, which I find deeply fascinating. Another thing that is interesting about this dish is its ingredients are foreign, or at least one of them, namely dill, therefore highlighted here. They are using blood as a thickener. Okay, you might find that in other contexts, but dill is not attested in any of the other recipes in this or any of the other two tablets that we have. It's an interesting phenomenon that to this day, dill is not very common in Iraqi food. It exists, but it's used in rather special circumstances, where those of you who are familiar with Iranian Persian cooking will know that dill is ubiquitous. That's kind of fun, that this might be one. It might also be total coincidence, but it might be one of these things where sort of very deeply ingrained things around taste, which you don't mess around with, right? For certain things like Christmas or Yom Kippur or whatever you fancy, you will cook in certain ways as your grandfathers and grandmothers did. You don't mess with this kind of stuff. And here you have, dill may be such a cultural survivor. So we found that rather interesting.
So this is the last recipe, and I think we're ending on a high note. This is one of the more successful recipes in the sense that it's delicious. We've cooked this together many, many times. The name tuhu, we think it means red beet. It is somewhat similar to a Eastern European borscht, right? It has that beet and it has meat. It's another meat dish. So you really just saute the leg of lamb. You add in spices. Again, you see the onion, arugula, cilantro, the beets, and the coriander and some cilantro on top. It's sort of a very stewy, rich dish, lamby, very, very, very delicious. There is one word in the middle, almost right in the middle to the left of the recipe, is the word samidu. Samidu. This is one of those examples where I think the experimental approach really helped us out. We thought that the translation for this was soapwort. Soapwort is a plant. It is occasionally used in cooking, but when it is, it's in a very special context. And we added this in with the stew and basically tasted the stew, and it was extremely bitter. And so we basically thought, this is crazy. So then we started over and we added just a little bit, and it was still extremely bitter. And the other thing that kept happening was that as it was boiling, it was foaming and foaming enormously. And Patricia, who is the gastronomist on the team, was like, this foaming agent is amazing. This is better than lecithin. This is better than what most chefs use in their kitchen. And so I think for us, what ended up happening was Gojko went back to the books. We reconsidered and realized that a more accurate translation may be Persian shallots, which you see listed down here in the English translation. This sort of rounds off the onion, arugula, and leek, fits better in the dish, seems like a more reasonable translation. So that was one thing that happened. It really made us reconsider the recipe. The other thing that happened was that Patricia and I went off and investigated the foaming properties of soapwort and found that it is very useful in a culinary context as a foaming agent. It has a beautiful, brilliant white color and foams very strongly and can be used in all kinds of contexts. So this ends our recipe. Gojko, Patricia, do you have anything to add before we go on? No.
No, I think in the interest of time, we should maybe move on to our new project. So we worked with the recipes. We got to a point where we were kind of satisfied with what we thought it can do and what we could do with them, so to say, and how far we could get in the reinterpretation of them. And if you compare them to Barjamovic, there are only subtle differences, which I think is a good sign. It's a sign that probably the fact that we can agree on the content shows that we probably got some of it right, at least. Instead, we have moved on to another project, one on bread, because among the many foodstuffs consumed by humans, that is arguably historically one of the most significant. And in Mesopotamia, when states and cities kick off, one of the very sort of profound markers of that transition from what was essentially village life everywhere in the world. Up until this time, there were nothing but villages, right? And then suddenly people start moving together in large groups and forming communities with stratification politically, with specialization in terms of, you're the potter and you're the policeman. And with that, you get this particular type of pottery known as the bevel rim bowl, and shown here on the right, which is, as you can see, not much of a stunner to look at. It's a very basic thing, but it appears by the tens of thousands on sites across the Near East, essentially from the Sinai to Pakistan, but with a marked concentration around Iraq and Syria, and southern Turkey and western Iran. And it's up to 80% of all pottery that has been preserved from a period from around 3400 BC, where all of this happens, that is from this one type of pot. So it is also, therefore, you can say the first known mass-produced item. Forget about the for tea. And it was not made in a potter's wheel, but it was created in a mold by sort of pressing clay down into a mold. Typically, they have a volume of about 1 liter. And we don't know what they were for. There is a general agreement that being so many of these, they have to have had some core economic feature in early society, but people have discussed this back and forth for a couple of generations now. However, people have already early on pointed out that there seems to be an apparent connection iconographically between a particular sign that appears on the very earliest tablets when writing is still kind of half pictorial, as you can see on the slide on the right-hand side lower down. And then the beveled rim bowl. I mean, it looks like a drawing of a beveled rim bowl. That sign in later texts, where we can actually read the text properly, we know that that was read as linda, which means bread. Okay, so in that case, maybe these vessels were used to produce bread and to distribute bread and therefore wealth, essentially, in these early societies on a massive scale. However, there's a problem with this interpretation that people have pointed out early on, and that is that by far the most common cereal, as Patricia said, was barley. It's about 80% of the Mesopotamian harvest at any given year. But a problem with barley is that it lacks the gluten to raise and produce a viable bread. Simply pouring a barley dough into a beveled rim bowl, as we know from trying it, will produce an inedible brick. So the aim of our project now is twofold. We want to identify ingredients and procedures that would allow us to actually use beveled rim bowls for bread production and see if it's possible in a way that is viable and suited for mass production. And secondly, we combine this with the analysis of later actual specimens of bread that have turned up at our museum at Harvard from the later Bronze Age.
So how we plan to approach experimentally all of these unaddressed questions and all of these hypotheses that all the archaeologists have been going through the different years. So first we want to test which grains they were used. Like, was just barley? Was barley with a little bit of wheat? They were using like liquid doughs instead of adding another grains. They were just adding much more water than we add nowadays in order to don't have these like inedible bricks of barley. Also, how was exactly the flour that they were using? Like what type of yeast they were using to leaven the bread? Was just legumes, like some of the archaeologists defend, were some type of sourdough? Like what were the oldest yeast that they were using in order to leaven these breads? Also, did they have other additives? We just have like one recipe that we identify with bread in the tablets, so we can have a sense of how did they look like, but what are all of these unaddressed questions? So we went to the lab and we already did some tests, but we are still like working on all of these like important key questions to understand how was the oldest baking, like a bread baking process. So I don't know if you want to add more things about the bread project, Pia or Gojko.
I think this is something that we have in the making, and as you can see, we have some bread down there in the right-hand corner that turned up just before COVID hit us all. So now we're terribly excited to get back to the lab and have this looked at on the microscopes and various other techniques. And with that, I guess we should thank our audience for their
time.
patience with us.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for everyone who was here.
Thank you guys very, very much. We have about, let's say 160 people on the phone watching. So it's always fantastic to be joined by so many people. I know you guys don't get to see any of those numbers where you're sat, but they are there, I promise. We have one quick question for you if you have time. But we're really interested, two quick questions actually. Thanks, Biospheres. But the first one I want to get to comes from Ellen on Zoom. She was curious that foaming agent that you talked about before, what are some modern uses of that? What do you use it for? A beverage or?
Well, Patricia can help me out, but I can start by saying that I have had a delicious cocktail where instead of an egg white foam on top, it was soapwort foam, and it was delicious. It was a great cocktail. But Patricia's tried a lot of other things.
Yes, people from the Basque Culinary Center help us to develop this like a foam in order to use it instead of egg whites to use soapwort. But you can also make like fantastic meringues that last forever because it's a super stable foaming agent. You can also make sponge cakes and replace the egg white by soapwort. So it has like some of the properties of the egg whites, but basically they stabilize foams. So any food that you can think of that involves a foam can be done using soapwort.
I think I'm gonna take Pia's suggestion on this one. And one last quick question about the bowls. Were they just trendy? Is that a possible explanation?
No, I don't think trend or fashion runs into it. One of the questions that we have here is from none other than Jill Golder, who's the person who has probably worked most on these bowls. And she says, yeah, they're fairly solid loaves, but not inedible. I tend to agree. I could probably eat them without breaking my teeth. But of course, that is not a smoking gun. I don't think that proves either way whether these things were used to make bread or for something different. But we have to think in alternatives, and Jill has really shown that this is probably the best explanation around at the moment. Others have suggested that they could have been used for salt transport and things like that, which I find totally unlikely.
Well, again, I'd like to thank you all for your time. It was an absolute pleasure learning from you. And there's loads of thanks pouring in as well, so thank you very, very much. I have two quick plugs just to tell everybody about. The Spice Team, which is how I'm going to refer to you now, the Spice Team's talk is actually the first of a two-part series in a way. Later in the year, we have students from Broughton and Wakestem early college high schools, which are both based here in Raleigh, and they're going to present some related research where they're going to tell us what happens when you make some of these recipes without some of their key ingredients. And that was to see whether the ingredients have functional roles in it, say, for example, preventing food from going bad, in addition to just helping it taste really good too. The last plug I have is the next Fermentology talk is going to be on October 15th, but it's not going to be on Zoom or YouTube. It's actually going to be on Instagram. Professor Rob Dunn is going to be chatting with the world-renowned baker, Vanessa Kimball, on her Instagram, which is called the Sourdough Club. But don't worry about it. I'm going to send out an email with all the information and how to connect to that and join in beforehand. So details to come. And once again, if you all want to help me thank our panel, the Spice Team, for showing up today, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.